Welcome everyone to the Fermentation Association's webinar of From Soil to Salami, Fermentation, Life, and Health. I'm Amelia Nielsen-Stoll, editor of TFA. We are a trade group that was launched to support producers who use fermentation to create delicious and often healthful food and beverages. Our goals are to help educate consumers about fermentation and its benefits, support scientific research into those health benefits, and work with food safety authorities to establish clearer and more appropriate regulations in regards to fermentation. Today, we bring you two great speakers, Meredith Leigh, author, farmer, and activist, and Kirsten Shockey, author and educator. We have many questions already reviewed and submitted with our speakers. If there are additional topics you'd like to see addressed, please enter them in the chat below and we will try to get to them. Meredith and Kirsten, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, everybody. As Amelia said, I'm Kirsten Shockey, fermentation writer, teacher, and I have the pleasure this morning, well, it's morning for me, of introducing my friend Meredith to you. I first met Meredith through her book way back, the first edition, the Ethical Meat Handbook. I think it's backwards, but it's a great book for any eater, by the way. And then our paths crossed at the Mother Earth News Fairs, sometimes more often than not, 6 times a year. And we had lots of heady conversations in between teaching. Often we were teaching at the same time, maybe separated by a curtain between us, and every once in a while, you know, the classes ebb and flow and it would get quiet and I'd hear Meredith talking about pig parts and scandalizing my vegetable students. And they just weren't, the kimchi students just weren't making the connection between that they were also butchering cabbage, right? So one of my favorite quotes though from her coming across from the other side was, relax, you're fermenting, it's none of your business. And so, yeah, we've had a lot of fun teaching together. We started collaborating then on the stages, teaching people about mold, and that was a lot of fun. And then fast forward to 2020, and we all were grounded. So as Meredith and I were both pivoting and trying to figure out what to do, we decided to collaborate again. We started a fermentation school, fermentationschool.com. And it's just, the idea is it's a collective of teachers who are talking about fermentation in all kinds of ways. We want to bring that beyond the table. And so, for example, we've got a mud cloth class we just released. That's art. It's fermenting mud and using the microbes. It's an ancient African tradition. Meredith is teaching fermented salami and koji charcuterie. So if you really want to know more from Meredith after this, I would suggest checking that out or checking out her other book, Pure Charcuterie. So Meredith is writer, activist, and teacher pursuing stories and experiences that invigorate the land to people connection by focusing on the intersection of land and people and land and cuisine. In these realms of writer and teacher, she wants to inspire dedication to good food, an appreciation of the land, farming, and the farmers themselves. She focuses on lesser explored, often ignored margins of the realms of science and food. So for example, you will see today in the deeper conversations of our connection to nature and not the separateness that we often have with our food and with nature, can be had with a conversation about salami. So at that, I will leave it to Meredith to get started.
Thanks, Kirsten. That's great that you brought up fermentation instead of your business, because that's like, I feel like that's what the conversation today is about, is like what the power we have when we make fermentation our business, right? Like whether it's just like, we're making it our business in terms of like bringing it into our consciousness and understanding how it works, or we're actually like making money off of this like incredible life force process, you know? But I want to say hey to everybody. It looks like we have a ton of folks from a lot of different places. I feel so honored to have the opportunity to bring sort of some of the stuff that I think about and work on to all of you and to learn from you as well. And I guess a little bit more of my background, I started out as a farmer and sort of a very land-based practitioner, raising vegetables as well as pasture-based meats, beef, pork, and poultry on a farm for over a decade. And as a means of sort of streamlining my business, I opened a butcher shop and restaurant to try and capture more profits instead of losing them to the processing sector, right? So really like exploring the different supply chain issues that a lot of farmers are facing at this point, specifically like smallholder farmers. And so I was in the restaurant business, and I was also working, overseeing my own butcher shop, where we weren't just bringing in our own animals from our own farm, but we were also bringing in animals from other farms in the region. And so it was, the idea was like a whole animal butcher shop that was serving only regional meats and meat products to a local regional audience. It was extremely educational, extremely difficult. And I did that for a while, and then I sold out of those businesses and just started focusing on education and writing, basically realizing that a lot of people in my very local or regional area still weren't ready to walk into the door of a whole animal butcher shop and really buy the whole animal and really, you know, approach meat eating in this way that felt right and ethical, and it's still attached to the land and culturally appropriate and all these different things. And so I sort of just threw myself at trying to translate, I guess, entire supply chain thinking to restaurant chefs and home cooks, basically, which was the subject of my first book, The Ethical Meat Handbook. And then, you know, my second book, Pure Charcuterie, which is what sort of has launched me into the fermentation world with a specific focus on meat, was making the further case that we can't really eat animals ethically and use their bodies in the most thrifty way if we're not incorporating some type of preservation. And that includes fermentation. So that's sort of, I guess, maybe an embellishment on the experience. What gives me any authority whatsoever to sit here and talk about my ideas as they pertain to fermentation. But basically, I guess my goals for today are to talk about like the position of meat in the fermentation conversation, like in the popular fermentation conversation, because I see it getting kind of bypassed. So I'm a bit on a mission there. And also to basically talk about, you know, and challenge us, all of us here as educators and curators and processors and growers and whoever we might be, to really sort of elevate the fermentation conversation in a way that I see being really vital right now as we face global pandemic and major socio-political unrest. So we're gonna go deep. We're gonna go deep and wide, hopefully.
So let's start there.
Yeah.
What does fermentation look like in meat products?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, you know, charcuterie, sometimes I think the reason meat gets sort of bypassed in fermentation conversations is because charcuterie is sort of this like vast umbrella of meat preservation, and it doesn't include all fermentation. Like some of the products are actually cooked, you know, not fermented at all, that fall under that umbrella. But there are definitely, you know, uncooked, preserved, salt preserved meat items that are very much like a beautiful culmination of a lot of different culinary fermentative processes that humans harness, right? And so it very much belongs, you know, in sort of on the docket of fermented superfoods, in my opinion. So we talked about salami, I guess, in the class advertisement. So we should just start there. Like let's take a deep dive like into the casing of a salami and look at what's happening. Like, I guess picture like a pretty small format sausage for our purposes, like maybe a standard size bratwurst or Italian sausage. And so it's going to be like, you know, you hang it up, and this is, you know, this is probably another reason why it doesn't make the list of foods we talk about, because the first couple of days that a sausage is fermenting, it's going to be like swollen and drippy, and it's going to be smelling kind of funny. And it's going against a lot of things that have been like beaten into you about like scrubbing under your fingernails and behind your ears and like shriveling up when you see a chicken egg straight out of the coop, or, you know, definitely don't put meat into a room that sort of resembles like a bathroom after a long hot shower. But that's kind of what you're doing essentially. And so it's really swollen. And what's going on inside there, as we know as fermenters, it's the same thing going on inside of a sauerkraut jar. It's just not necessarily talked about as much, but all the sugars that are in that sausage, either from, you know, traditionally like wines or any other added sweeteners, are being metabolized by fermentative microorganisms. So they're consuming those sugars, metabolizing them into acids and alcohols. And it's kind of like, you know, it's not exactly like a beautiful process, right? If you zip it down to the microscopic level, like there's a lot of death happening. There's a lot of like exploding. There's a lot of engorging. My 8-year-old son calls fermentation a war. It's like the sugar battle, right? So there's like beings that are running in there and they're on this feeding frenzy and they're going after all these sugars. And some of them are actually eating so many sugars that they're, you know, exploding, right? And the enzymatic soup of those explosions is like part and parcel of the flavor that we associate with fermented foods. You know, some of those microorganisms are actually failing to access those sugar resources and starving to death, right? And so there's like this wholesale war sort of going on in there. And I
think, you know, something people don't necessarily think about with fermentation is that it's like each of those communities and microbes are out for themselves.
Right.
Like, yeah, there is this symbiotic thing that has to happen for each of the different products, but they're still, you know, they're for themselves. So I think it's
totally
a really interesting thing. And yet they do work it out. You know, I think meat products or miso is some of the examples where there's just so many in there doing it all at the same time. But yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And I think like I have a lot of students who kind of call me, you know, this is where the like it's none of your business comment comes from. Is I have a lot of my students who will call me during that like first 2 to 5 days of the sausage. You know, it's not nearly as like sensory like shocking to the senses in a jar of kraut, you know, or a crock of miso. But when it comes to fermenting meats, like I think people definitely have, you know, like a shock factor, you know, the first couple, maybe first 5 times that you ferment a sausage, you know, people will call me and be like, oh my gosh, what's happening? You know, it smells really crazy. It's really drippy. It's really swollen. And I'm like, close the door. It's none of your business. You know what I mean? Because you're fermenting. You know, and that's like, you know, the advice is disarming because it's amusing, but it's also, you know, it's really true. It's like, you know, you're in there tinkering, you sort of have control over this process, but you sort of don't. And that's like a good thing, you know, that you're not completely and totally in control. You're surrendering to nature, you know. What's that?
You're much more of a microbe shepherd.
That's
you're
right.
Trying to hear everybody, but you have no control.
That's right. And I think, you know, so I guess to fully communicate like everything that's going on inside of a sausage. So after that first couple of days of fermentation, you know, think of it like night falls, right? Like the big sugar battle's over. And basically what happens is like, as that was going on, as that feeding frenzy was happening, you know, it's encouraged by heat, right? Sugar and heat, just like any other fermentative process. But the frenzy itself creates more heat, right? And so there's this environment that's really welcoming to these particular microbes. But their very fervor for it, like completely changes it wholesale. Like they eat up all the sugars, they explode. There's this enzymatic soup. There's all these dead bodies, you know, and then like, there's no more sugar left. Everything sort of starts to like dry up, cool off. And the whole process begins to move into another phase, which is really properly more like the curing phase of the process. And so, you know, in general, I think it's really helpful, like for the purpose of our discussion, to think of each sausage as its own ecosystem, you know, in its casing. And the reactions, you know, going on inside, fueled by millions of organisms. And so a couple more groups of bacteria, it's like a couple of different genera, let's just say, are moving in the second phase. And they're only moving in when the pH is dropped from that sugar frenzy. And they're only working at really kind of slow processes. But these are two other groups of microbes that come in and are responsible for sort of like the curing, flavoring, coloring, and like culmination of the process. So if those critters are stewarded properly by the curator, then, you know, like lower humidity levels, lower temperatures in general, then you're going to get shelf stability, and you're going to get beautiful color, and you're going to get really complex flavor. And that's kind of, I guess, like in a really general sense, you know, what's going on inside of a salami. But I guess the thing I want to like drive to the group listening is like, even if you're not a person who creates fermented meats, it's important to understand that there's like bacterial fermentation going on, there's yeast fermentation going on, there's mold fermentation going on, there's acetic acid being produced, there's autolysis, which is the process basically of like, you know, we see it in the natural world in death and decay. So enzymes present like in an organism that then go to work digesting that organism after its death. And it's certainly more controlled in fermentation, but it happens when we work with mold-based fermentation like koji, it happens when we're making miso, it happens when we are curing salamis, that enzymes from the microbial essentially deaths, and also enzymes that are in the meat itself, are harnessed in that process to sort of like help break down the food and make it really complex. And so like, if you think about it, you know, salami essentially is like a really beautiful culmination of a lot of known culinary fermentative processes. And so I just want to, you know, put that out there, even if you're not a practitioner, you know, you're not necessarily excluded either from the conversation here.
And it's so delicious.
What's that?
And it's so delicious.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about how this parallels the soil or on the farm level?
Totally. I think like one of the reasons you said earlier, like some people don't really think of the initial stage of fermentation being like a war or characterized as a battle. And I think one of the reasons that I have gone there to that, like, you know, the inclusion of that sort of like the death that's involved in the process is because it really mirrored my experience on the farm, you know, and seeing those patterns mirrored. On the farm, we're constantly working with cycles of life and death, you know, and cooperation and cataclysm, and, you know, all these different sort of like life to death, death to life, you know, in turn. And so I guess, you know, if we're going to stick with the salami theme, like think about a hog, you know, specifically a hog, you know, that animal in particular can alter more soil in a single day, you know, than almost any other domesticated animal can think of, aside from humans. And so if you think about it, like from a microbial level, like here comes this big monstrous snout, you know, down into the soil. It's freaking disastrous, right? It's disastrous. But what's happening too, when that rooting is happening from the hog and the saliva and the dung and the urine are going into the soil, is that there's also, you know, life is sparked, you know, seeds are awakened, seeds grow, there's a microbial response, right? That, you know, informs what we know now from looking at the science, like it informs healthier cycling in the soils, like better water absorption, like better soil cover, more broader, you know, leaf area in the regenerated plant. And the same goes for ruminant animals like cows and sheep, you know, that they are actually, you know, for lack of a better word, like fermenting a process in the soil that's symbiotic, right? And encouraging more, you know, plant cover on the soil, which encourages more solar capture. And if those microbial sort of life-death life cycles in the soil are happening more in a more stable way, we now, you know, sort of understand better that that means the farming system is more intact, right? It's more resilient, it's healthier for the planet, and on and on and on. And so, you know, take it a step further and go, okay, now this hog is going to be slaughtered. you know, the hog's going to die. And in the wild, an animal dies and its body decays by processes of fermentation as well as autolysis, which we talked about in the salami. But in a hog that's slaughtered and kind of taken out of the industrial sense, because we're talking about like ethical meat that's more relational, like, you know, hog slaughter used to be an extremely ritualistic act. And so traditionally, you know, the animal's blood was going back into the soil, the inedible entrails are going back into the soil and, you know, sort of fomenting further microbial frenzies. And then the meat was going into the hands of traditionally women and youth who were then like turning it into these amazing products, and the food was nourishing the body and then informing, you know, the fermentative processes that are involved in digestion and waste elimination. And so I think what I'm like driving is that like me getting into charcuterie and working in meat fermentation really just like threw all this redundancy right into my face, you know, like fermentation is actually like the indispensable process in like all parts of the supply chain, you know, all parts of the food chain, you know, it's the thing that makes nature work. And I think that that's a really powerful way of thinking about it, you know, like as practitioners of fermentation, because I guess it, you know, for me, it's a really sort of, it's a way of thinking about managing systems, you know, that are more holistic and more resilient. And if we come at the farm, or if we come at the processing of, you know, animals, or the farming of animals, or even vegetables in a way that's like cognizant of those fermentative processes, cognizant of the microbial signature that we're sort of leaving, you know, every time we do something, you know, then we're therefore stewarding, you know, more resilient and like earth friendly and people friendly systems.
For sure. I mean, and it is fascinating. I mean, this isn't the farm, but, you know, here in the Pacific Northwest, where they have, you know, giant trees and still, you know, a little tiny peek to what some of these forest systems were like. The microbial systems are fascinating. And then what's really fascinating too is, you know, in these old growth trees, you will find the, you know, DNA from salmon, because the bear brought the salmon out of the river, ate it, pooped, you know, in the upland somewhere. And I mean, that's the thing that just, as humans, we just need to think about this over and over again, that it's going on.
Yeah.
We've so taken it away from our soil and our farming systems and forest management too. I mean, all of it, just, you know, so bringing that back in, I find it fascinating. It's sort of fascinating. But it's in that same realm of, you know, what's happening to the pig's body as it decays and goes back in as well.
Totally. And like, I think specifically with animals, like in many ways, we've taken all of our agriculture and made it so industrial that it's like completely removed from these cycles that were very obvious to people who are connected to the land, you know? But I think specifically with animals, it's like the more capital intensive and the more, you know, industrial it's become, and like all the animals have been taken out of context with the land, you know, and these cycles and these sort of like, dare I say, sacred patterns that we're talking about right now, you know, and it becomes, you know, sort of impossible for the everyday eater, or even the everyday, or even like the curator, you know, somebody who's making like really fine fermented products on, you know, a commercial scale, to sort of recognize a connection that they have to those, like, to that beautiful redundancy, you know, that and integrated, you know, beauty that makes nature work, you know, and is sort of the key to like taking back our food systems.
Yeah, those microbial signatures.
Right. Right. So like, I guess for me, like, I guess realizing at some point that like, you know, we can think of everything, like even if you're doing the most brilliant type of farming possible, like it's still really extractive and really intense, you know, so like, even if you're planting a tree, what you're doing like on a microbial level is sort of cataclysmic, right? So the question is then like, what, yeah, like how am I thinking about the microbial signature that I'm leaving, like with every action that I'm doing, like spitting my gum out on the pavement, or if I'm like planting, you know, a kale plant, like how am I, you know, keeping that in my mind?
Yeah. It can be crazy making once you start thinking about it, because then you don't want to walk across your yard.
Well, I don't think it's like, I don't want it to sound like paralyzing. I think it's almost kind of liberating, you know what I mean? In some ways, but yeah, so like I can give you an example at the farm level.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask, what do you see? How do you see that, like those signatures being walked successfully in the business?
Yeah, so I just finished up writing this article about this really inspirational woman in North Vietnam, who's she bases her entire system of raising pigs on fermentation, essentially, which is just fascinating. So she does something called, and I saw in some of the registration questions, somebody mentioned Korean natural farming. This is a very similar premise to that, like effective microbes being used in combination with animals. So she, and people in community in, you know, rural area of Hanoi in North Vietnam were actually doing this, burying these barrels of rice and growing mold on top of them, and then harvesting those molds off and like combining them with other microbes and spraying them. So they'll build up like a deep, like 70-centimeter layer of bedding. It could be like rice hulls, it could be, you know, straw, it could be, I think originally sawdust. And then they're spraying essentially these microbes that they've harvested onto this bedding, and then they're putting their hogs in it. So the hogs are actually like confined in a house. They're not in crates, they're not on concrete. They can roam around in the house. But this is not a landscape that's actually conducive to pasturing hogs. So they're in this house, but they're on this deep bed that's basically sprayed with these microbes. And then as they dung and urine into the bedding and then root around in it, they're essentially like composting in place their own dung and urine. So if you were to like stick your arm all the way down into it, it'd be very hot on the bottom layer, right? Because there's a lot of like microbial activity going on below, but it's pretty ambient on the top layer. And the result is like, there's no smell, there's no runoff, there's no, you know, there's no waste. And so this woman is like, she's like experimenting with different microbes and different substrates. Like, you know, can we use biochar? Can we use, you know, since sawdust is really expensive for farmers in Vietnam, can we use these other, you know, these other substrates? Or can we after a certain number of years harvest this bedding and use it as compost on, you know, a vegetable portion of the farm, and then like keeping a portion of it as a starter, you know, like think like a bread starter. Can we then add more and achieve the same effect? And what kinds of plants can we put on the sides and the ceiling of the hog house to like purify the air and do these additional things, right? So it's almost like, you know, this land base is now being managed like to support these microbes, right? And the hogs and the meat, right, are like a byproduct of this, you know, microbe farming that's going on. And I think that's, so that article, as I just saw somebody's comment, it's going to be, there's a small part of her story that's going to be published in the Mother Earth News magazine coming up soon as part of an article that I've written. But I am looking to write about her more and feature her more. And quite frankly, would love to see like the genius of this woman in North Vietnam being like put down in some hog houses in Iowa. Because think about like the beautiful fermentation that could occur there in terms of like designing systems, because the principles are not, you know, they sound wildly different, but they're designed and could be functional in some settings that we consider pretty disastrous right now in the US. So I think that's pretty,
that would
pretty
be
awesome. What's that?
That would be absolutely amazing.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, just try that on for a moment.
Right. Yeah, smoke that over.
I think we had a question about it in the pre-questions, but also I know that you're doing a lot with food sovereignty and food security, and, you know, really talking about, you know, indigenous cultures and farming, and yeah, do you want to talk about that in your work as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the story of Trong actually kind of like highlights that, just the fact that, you know, smallholder farmers globally, I think, are growing on like 25% of the Earth's land, but feeding about 70% of the population. And, you know, vice versa, industrial farmers are feeding about 30% of the world population and using a vast number of the Earth's natural resources. And so, you know, looking to, particularly like when it comes to livestock, women, specifically women of color, indigenous women of color, are the stewards of livestock genetics and of seed diversity, you know, around the world, and looking at the practices that are sort of like used by and understood by and have been, you know, completely established by indigenous cultures is important, you know, and understanding, instead of like attributing all the, you know, advancements towards silvopasture and agroforestry and all those things towards like the sustainable agriculture movement. They're actually like indigenous practices, you know, that have been like re-understood or uptaken by the sustainable agriculture movement. And that's a great thing. But I think, you know, just credit where credit's due. And I think also like, you know, in the fermentation world, like, especially when it comes to charcuterie, like I'm, you know, and you, if you follow me on Instagram, you saw my rant last week about the charcuteries are expensive Lunchables meme, because I really can't handle that in so many ways. One, because charcuterie is poor people's food. It's been the food developed by some of the most industrious, you know, and limited resource people around the world. And it's not a specifically European tradition, even though the word charcuterie is a French word. There's equivalent word in many different cultures. And if you take my online charcuterie courses, my training is in European techniques, but you can find equivalent techniques in Africa and in the Middle East and other things. And I think also just like going back to what we were talking about with these like patterns and the redundancy in nature and sort of the sacredness of, you know, the integrated approach to land, you know, is really important, because this is something that was sort of just like folded into the fabric of indigenous peoples and is folded into the fabric of indigenous people's existence, like people being connected to the land, you know, and the fact that like I am right here, a white woman, like on unceded territory of the Cherokee people, like telling this story is the proof in the pudding that like the reason this story is not necessarily understood by the everyday eater is because we like scrubbed out those people and stole their land and all this other stuff, you know? So if we were actually like people of the land and understood, you know, these sacred cycles and patterns and the redundancy that makes nature work, then we probably wouldn't have the food system issues that we have today, right? So I think that like, especially in the fermentation conversation, if we're talking about like the microbial signatures that we're leaving and how there's this beautiful sacred like concentric patterning going on from like farm to table, you know, and recognizing that like the land ethic that has been erased or invisibilized of, you know, people of color or indigenous folks, like that's a really powerful story, you know, that fermenters get to tell, you know, that we get to say like, you know, hey, here's how we can start to acknowledge and repair harm and, you know, sort of give credit where credit's due and do the work of unlearning and relearning, like how to be in conversation with land and animals and each other in a way that is more sound and holistic and just. So that might've been a little more than of a soapbox than you wanted, but I guess I just wanna like challenge, you know, I think like the popular media conversation about fermentation, like just really isn't doing all of that. You know what I mean? Like our production of these foods or curation of these foods is not only a way to elevate health, right? Human health or like flavor, but it's also a way of like commenting on and changing culture. And so I just want like, you know, I think I just want that, I think I want that to go in the recording.
Well, you know,
Yeah.
I do think there's a couple things there that struck me as you were talking. And one is, you know, talking about these indigenous cultures that are, you know, land-based, their stories, their everything was place-based. And then the white people that came in, their stories, you know, their religion or whatever, they brought that from somewhere else. So it's kind of, I don't know if I'm going to say this how I'm trying to think it, but it's kind of, I think part of that whole thing is our culture as white Europeans bring with us our stories instead of looking at, you know, what is here and kind of moving into what works. And then the other thing is just along with that and the Lunchable conversation is, I think, something I struggle with in sort of that conversation that's out there is that fermented foods and fermentation, even doing your own, has become sort of elitist in its view. And it just isn't that. You know, it's kind of the cheapest, easiest way for somebody to take just the smallest bit of control of their own food system, you know, just that act of, you know, buying that cabbage and letting the microbes go at it. So that is an interesting conversation, you know, the word charcuterie, it's French, and so suddenly it seems elitist because of that, where it's, you know,
right.
It's been done in all cultures. Meat preservation is a thing.
That's right. And I think it's sort of a both and conversation. Like, it is both elitist and not elitist. You know what I mean? And like, you know, some of the stuff that I do and try to push chefs to do is like not something that the everyday cook is going to be able to do, you know, and buying meat that's like relational and that's outside of that industrial paradigm that's like, you know, really causing a lot of suffering of animals and people is not possible for everyone. And that's like, there's policy stuff there, you know, so it's not just like everybody ferment meat and it all of a sudden be ethical. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say. You know, there's definitely like picking at the policy knot is like one side of this, you know, but another side of it is actually what we're talking about now, like the reframing of it culturally. And I think in general, you know, like if I look at the foods that we consume as humans and the foods that people have access to, like meat, of almost of all of those things, like meat needs fermentation on its, like the fermentation community needs to get on meat, right? Because like, how else are we going to like redefine portion size or alter palatability or texture, all the different ways in which our popular culture feels entitled to meat on the menu? Like, you know, I just feel like curing and fermenting is a way to like move the needle on that culture side of things, so that it's not completely, you know, out of reach and elitist and like impossible for us to make change. So I guess we're supposed to take questions soon. So I just like would leave it with that challenge. Like, you know, most people in our day and age are going to be completely removed from the land. You know, I think we're moving into the generation that like won't have memory, you know, even of like their grandparents owning land or their great grandparents having land, and they won't have the place-based and maybe never ever will be able to see and feel and witness firsthand, you know, what the life cycles of like raising a hog or you know, raising a cabbage are like. But through the popularity of fermentation and people like putting that jar of kraut on their counter or making that salami, there is a window there into those like really sacred patterns and those cycles that we're talking about. And so if we as like producers, curators, you know, knowledge bearers of fermentation, if we're not telling that part of the story, you know, to the people who are, you know, really into fermented foods, then in a way we're sort of like, we're not doing anybody any favors, you know what I mean? Like, we're just sort of like making money, you know. Yeah, we're putting good food out there, but I think that that's part of like really, really connecting people back through fermented food is one of the more hopeful ways right now that we have of telling that story to people who will never touch soil and who will never slaughter a pig or any of those things. So
yeah, now let's open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Meredith. This has been so insightful. Let me start with a few of the questions we had. You just issued a challenge to everybody on how we can further connect to, our farming roots. Tell me, how can we become more considerate eaters?
Well, I mean, I think in my mind, like I focus a lot on regional relational food, if you're able. This is not a consumer blaming. This is not a holding the individual as like responsible, because what we know is that the food system is completely corporatized and controlled, and that it's not the job of the individual eater, particularly people who are disenfranchised, living in poverty, don't have access to transportation. Like, it's not appropriate to say like, go to the farmer's market, especially if your farmer's market feels like a really hostile place to you, So I think that like, there's a way that like, if you have the privilege and the permission to like buy your food in a relational way, then definitely go do that, And if you don't, I think it's just like, try to own it, try to own your culinary journey, try to take it back, as much as you can. And sometimes that means going and using your voice, using your voice in a political way, and it doesn't necessarily mean like where you're buying your food or what you're doing to it. But as Kirsten pointed out, like part of that both and conversation is that there are some really, really approachable ways to like get more out of the food, like nutritionally, through fermentation, through different culinary approaches, to stretch things farther. And I think that like, I'm really open to making that information as open source as possible. I think there are a lot of people working to that end. And I would say access that information, because it's there in order to help, it's in order to help people, be more autonomous and sovereign over the food that they're eating.
Where do you think people should focus their food activism in 2021?
I don't know. I feel like that's a really like individual question, for somebody to like base on their specific position or permission, I think like for me, I'll answer it for myself. Like, I definitely want to get more political in 2021. I think it's just like, it's time for a lot of accountability, and I think that, food and specifically meat, like it's a very political issue. And so if, you're in a position to focus your activism in a political way, then do that, but I think, if you're somebody who's just like struggling to get your health under control, then your food activism might be like more individualistic or, based on a culinary approach or a sourcing approach or something like that. And definitely always like supporting like local regional producers and people that you can like shake the hand of, maybe not in the time of COVID, but you know what I mean? Like, get relational with your food if you possibly can, is better.
How do you see like eating habits changing in the future, especially as we're, still in the middle of this pandemic, we're seeing climate change? Where do you think, I guess, Americans' eating habits will change?
Well, I think we've already seen, food systems and food supply chains like struggling to get more regional, struggling to become more regionally sufficient. And so I think that I already see people's habits changing in that way. And for, really mutual aid, in support of good food for all becoming more accessible, right? And so I guess that's another piece of activism that I should mention. And, the Fermentation Association could decide whether you want to edit this out, but like operating in loopholes feels like a great piece of activism to me in support of mutual aid that will not only change people's food access options, but also change their eating habits, So I think that that's, something that I'm working on for Meat Mutual Aid. Like, we saw crippling breakdowns in the meat processing infrastructure. So what can we do on our local level to have more control over our supply chain? How can we make sure that people in our food shed have control over their meat supply chain, and how do we work within loopholes in the food code to make that happen, you know? I also think that like definitely because of the whole fermented foods boosting immunity, people are, you know, eating more fermented foods. And my hope is that, you know, the funkier, the better, because we really need like people to be able to stretch their palate understanding in order to get specifically like meat products into a better, sort of more sustainable, ethical situation within the food system.
We're seeing so much about, you know, alternative proteins today, you know, from burgers and sausages, different food companies using fermentation techniques to make these alternative proteins. Tell me about what are your thoughts on that? How do you feel about the alternative proteins?
Oh, let's see. We don't have enough time for me to tell you how I really feel about the alternative proteins, but I guess what I would say is that I feel like they're really just a corporate solution to like further line the pockets of like really greedy, you know, yeah, money barons. I don't really see them as like viable, you know, I mean, certainly they will feed people and that's a good thing, you know, where hunger exists. But, you know, like if you read my book, then you'll read like, you know, I want food with the sun in it. And I think that that's completely possible, you know, for us to do. You know, if we can put people on the moon, I certainly think that we can work out ways to like grow food and produce food that actually has the sun in it and all the dynamic resources that are in the soil. You know, that actually, you know, translate into a healthy body, you know, and vibrant bodies. And that's a complex process. So I think that like, you know, cheap meat, industrial meat, test tube meat, all these things are like, you know, they're really attractive because they seem like silver bullet solutions that fit into like the status quo of cheap meat and like easily accessible meat. But ultimately, in my opinion, they're not the answer.
Well, and I mean, it's one of those things too. There's tempeh, which is a, you know, a great alternative to meat, has the sun in it, has the live microbes in it, and you know that isn't going to line the pockets of more scientific food, and so it's just not as interesting to try to get some of these foods out there that are ancient and beautiful and all of that could also take that place with I think a much smaller footprint.
Yeah, I love that. I think we've had a few comments about that, about using fermented plant products instead of using tech heavy alternative proteins. So tell me, both of you, what fermented flavors do you see overlapping across different types of ferments, from like meat to cheese to beverages to vegetables?
I mean, I think the flavor of kimchi is always popular. The fact that, you know, you saw it sprinkled onto like chips or something the last few years as a fake kimchi. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard for me to say what the trends are. I'm just stuck away in my little mountain home here. I agree with Meredith though. The funkier, the better. I think we are seeing people just in the, I don't know, 12 years I've been really more in the outer world, I guess, talking to people is people are coming around to, they don't want everything to taste the same. And I think that's huge.
Yeah, and I think also just like, what I like seeing is people realizing that the experience of food is not, it's not like a quantity thing anymore. It's more of a quality complexity thing. So it's not a specific flavor, but I think just like the punch and the umami, you know, and the funk is like really becoming more understandable to people. And so that's really promising from my point of view, specifically when it comes to protein, because it's like, you know, smaller portions, more complex flavor over like big chunks of flesh that, you know, are ultimately not in service of like thrift or sustainability ultimately.
Okay, we had a few questions about how How do people go about now? How does like a producer starting a fermentation business or trying to sell their fermented products, how do they go about then teaching consumers about these benefits? We're seeing more consumers interested in fermentation, but many aren't sure of the benefits. What's the best way to teach the general public about this?
I think just they need to keep learning about what the process is. I mean, the type of articles that Meredith is writing and all of that. These are the things that will bring people back to buying the products, even if they're not going to even if they're not going to make them themselves. I find that learning to make these products or having somewhat of an understanding of what's going on makes them so much more approachable.
Yeah, I mean, I think pointing to the science for sure, and there's some science out recently about the benefits, not even just of like probiotics or whatever, but of postbiotics and like the dead bodies I was talking about, right? So like taking that in, I think for a lot of people is new information. So, you know, there is science out there that can be cited by businesses, you know. For me, like, I know that people always come at things like this from a human health standpoint first, which I think is fine. But ultimately, like, there are so many other reasons to, you know, ferment foods, like, you know, from a planetary perspective, ecological perspective, social justice perspective, like there's all these different reasons. So, you know, I don't necessarily feel the need to fixate on like some peer-reviewed article that tells me whether my specific product is going to like be, you know, 14% of X daily value of, you know, ABC. But I think, you know, that information is out there. But I think that, you know, even just like getting on your Instagram or getting on your, you know, your social media and just talking about the whole system benefits of the products that you make and like why you do what you do and the passion behind why you do what you do makes a big difference for people, you know, especially in this day and age who are like looking for like the spunk in the fire behind like why we do anything that we do, you know, like, so yeah, just start talking about it, I think is the best way to do it.
We just had a question come in, Meredith. You know, you mentioned talking about the health benefits. That's often the first talking point. What are the health benefits of meat fermentation?
The health benefits of meat fermentation. Well, I think if you look at the most traditional examples of meat fermentation, we're looking at situations where meat was actually very scarce. You know, it was not something that people, so take one of the oldest ferments in the entire lexicon of fermentation is garum. It's fish sauce, right? So these are areas where like fishery resources are rich, but other meats are not necessarily very available. And what they're doing is they're packing the meat in with a bunch of salt just to make a stable environment for all the decay and rot and autolysis to go on that would naturally go on when those fish died. But what we find out is that people eating just like a ½ ounce of fish sauce in a day is up to like 9 or 10% of the protein requirement of an individual in a day's time. So like juxtapose that to the very like global north way of eating meat, you know, and meeting iron and protein requirements, you know, through like eating these big hunky steaks or like, you know, chewing through mussels. So, but flip the script on that and say like, okay, fermented foods are really packing that punch. Like this is a different way to get a super concentrated amount of flavor and protein. And then, of course, like tacking on, if you're eating an uncooked fermented meat product, it is a living food, just like a jar of sauerkraut. It doesn't have a high enough water activity to really harbor the kind of probiotics that something like a sauerkraut would. It's got a pretty low water activity to keep it safe, but there's still going to be living organisms in there, particularly if there's a mold cultured on the outside of it. And the postbiotics that are represented and that like sugar battle that went on inside of it, as well as like the yeast fermentation and all the metabolites that have come from those microbes, you are getting postbiotics when you eat fermented meat. So that's just a few examples that are hopefully helpful, whoever asked that question.
Well, Meredith, Kirsten, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and your passion with us. Clearly you are both very passionate about this topic. I appreciate you being here with us today. And thank you to all of you for attending today's webinar. We will post a recording of this on TFA's website in the next 24 hours. Our next webinar will be Miso, Traditional Flavors with Modern Application, with Hiroko Shimbo, Kirsten Shockey again, and Kyle Connaughton, moderated by Robert Donnie. Please go to fermentationassociation.org to check these out and register. And while you're there, subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. And if we didn't get to your question, Meredith and Kirsten are both very active on their Instagram accounts. So go check them out.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.